Hello, I'm Steve Olson, Chair of the Weber County, Utah Democrats. I'd like to talk a little bit today about an important subject for the upcoming election in 2012, the Great Recession. What caused it? What have we learned from it? And how can application of our Utah values lead the nation to recovery and a secure future for our children? A few principles for our discussion. I have faith in the absolute truth of my own religion, applied humbly to my own life, of course. But everything else falls into the philosophies of men category. This includes political ideologies. They do not qualify as absolute truth. Maybe in more blunt language is this quote from one of our founding fathers, President John Adams: "Ideology is the science of idiots." I like this quote from George Box. All models are wrong, some are useful. What Box is saying here is us imperfect humans are never going to be able to perfectly explain the things of our world, but some models can be useful, and we're going to talk about one of those models today. I love this quote from Diane Ravitch, a former Assistant Secretary of Education. What should we think of someone who never admits error, never entertains doubt, but adheres to the same ideas all his life, regardless of new evidence? It is doubt that shows we are still thinking, still willing to re-examine hardened beliefs when confronted with new facts and new evidence. So let's look at some things with an open mind. What caused the Great Recession? It's been discussed a lot the last 4 or 5 years. And you know some of the answers we've heard. Just scroll through these. We won't go into them in too much detail. But what I want to jump to is a couple of things that might help us in answering this question. In my work as an engineer, we use something called the 5 why technique. And it's very simple. You keep asking why until the real root cause is discovered. I believe most theories of the cause of the Great Recession don't go deep enough. We stop asking why too soon. Another important tool that I use is benchmarking. Has there been a similar event in our history we might learn from? And of course the answer to that is the Great Depression. I'd like to look at the Great Depression through the eyes of a famous Utahn, banker and industrialist, Mariner Eccles. Everybody recognizes him as a important business figure, but many Utahns don't realize he was also an important government figure. He was an early economic advisor to President Roosevelt and chair of the Federal Reserve for 14 years. In fact, the Federal Reserve Building in Washington, D.C. is named for Mariner Eccles. His story is taken from his autobiography, which was published in the early 50s. Up until 1929, he was a hard-nosed free market Republican tycoon. But then the 1929 crash happened. At first, his views reflected most American businessmen, that this was just a normal economic correction and the natural workings of the market would soon return the nation to prosperity. But this was different. Things continued to get worse. As a trusted community leader, people started coming to him for answers. What's going on? He started to wonder if things had changed, if the environment had been altered, and if some of the economic principles that had guided the nation were no longer applicable. So he engaged in a mental exercise to try to answer these questions. He pondered the prevalent theories at the time of the Great Depression. Again, that they're a self-correcting force and that they were useful and would clean wasteful and unproductive elements out of the system. Some people thought we were being punished for our spendthrift ways during the 20s. And, of course, investment in new technologies would be a tool that would pull us out of the Depression. He examined each of these theories and decided that something didn't feel right, that they didn't make sense. As part of this mental exercise, he had some insights. Number one, a significant change in the American economy had been that the subjugation of the American West had been accomplished. This had provided outlet for capital investments that no longer existed. He also realized that the more successful capitalism became, the more individuals were dependent upon it for employment. Mechanization and automation spurred by capitalism made many individual labor-intensive efforts profitless. His father David had gotten his first steak by taking an axe into the Oregon wilderness and turning logs into cash. Well, we use machines to harvest logs now. Cutting down logs with an axe is not profitable, and there are many other examples. He reasoned investments in new technologies would only happen during times of prosperity. In our day, a family is not going to go buy a 50-inch widescreen TV if they can't put food on the table or can't pay their rent. Capital investment and hiring in general would come to a halt as long as there was excess capacity during an economic downturn. If a business has more capacity than demand, they have no need to hire people or invest in equipment. Number 5, the data showed the only area where America had been profligate in the 20s was in financial speculation. When looking at actual consumptions of goods and services by consumers, the economy of the 20s was, in aggregate, if anything, too thrifty. There was too much capital in the system, chasing too little demand. These insights led to his great epiphany. I began to see that we had reached a stage where further advances in the national income and in our standard of living depended on finding an adequate outlet for the nation's savings. For while savings that are invested in new enterprises are beneficial, savings that find no outlet and accumulate as idle or hoarded funds result in a depression. These excess savings are the root cause of bubbles. As mass production has to be accompanied by mass consumption in turn applies a distribution of wealth as it is produced to provide men with buying power equal to the amount of goods and services offered by the nation's economic machinery. Instead of achieving that kind of distribution, a giant suction pump had by 1929 drawn into a few hands an increasing portion of wealth. This served as capital accumulation. But by taking purchasing power out of the hands of mass consumers, the savers denied to themselves the kind of effective demand for their products that would justify a reinvestment of their capital. As in a poker game where the chips were concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, the other fellows could stay in the game only by borrowing. When their credit ran out, the game stopped. This is what happened to us in the 20s. So he came upon a good theory to explain what happened. What's the solution? How do you get out of the depression? And based on these insights, Eccles developed a new theory of macroeconomics. First, that deficit spending by the government during times of recession is necessary to absorb excessive capacity and stimulate private enterprise to put people back to work. Second, once the economy is brought back into balance, government budgets need to be balanced and surpluses created to offset the danger of a boom on the upswing, and also, of course, to keep the national debt in check. The methods of government spending should be chosen to stimulate a maximum amount of private expenditures with a minimum amount of public expenditures. The government, as the sole possessor of the power to issue money and credit, should use these powers to influence a balanced price structure. Next, the government should use its powers of taxation to control the accumulation and distribution of wealth and production to create a proper balance between production and consumption. And this gets back into the balance where capital and demand need to equal each other. Lest you're thinking right now the socialism word, let's add the last two bullets. Government should never displace or compete with private activity, but it can put idle men, idle funds, idle productive facilities to work in socially useful ways. It can provide roads, bridges, and many other necessities of modern civilization that private enterprise does not and cannot be expected to provide, as Adam Smith noted. One thing that Eccles did during these few months is actually read The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's book on free markets, where he talks about the wealth-creating ability of free markets, but also warns us of the dangers and what governments need to do to work against those dangers of free markets. Last, according to the maxim of Adam Smith, they should be pursued according to the greater or lesser extent to which private activity absorbs the unemployed. From these personal reflections, he began to publicize his new insights in speeches to business groups. His prescriptions differed from other business leaders who were calling for lower taxes and reduced government spending to, quote, remove uncertainty, unquote. His message was simple. Business wasn't hiring not because of uncertainty, it was because they had no customers. The depression would end only when demand increased enough to absorb excess capacity. And when the customers were lined up out the door and they didn't have capacity to serve them, they would then hire and invest in new capacity. His testimony got the attention of President Roosevelt, and together with new policies of financial regulations, Eccles' theories became the foundation of the New Deal. Well, back to one of our original principles. Was the Eccles model useful? Eccles' macroeconomic theories became the foundation of running the American economy for decades, from just before the Second World War until quite recently. And so the question is, how did this model work? We have here a graph showing business cycles from about 1915 to about the year 2000. The period immediately after World War II until recently is known by economists as the quiet period. And you can see that the degree of peaks and valleys in the business cycle were dampened tremendously compared with previous years. And so it appears that the Eccles model worked. It worked so well that economists were starting to say just a few years ago that depressions had been solved, that there was no longer a worry. Well, those experts were wrong. We suffered a repeat severe economic crisis. Why was that? Was the Eccles model wrong, or do the events leading up to our own Great Recession fit the Eccles model and mimic the mistakes that we made that led to the Great Depression of 1929? Well, let's examine that. Was there excessive capital in the economy leading up to the Great Recession, creating pressure for speculation? Well, there's several statistics that support that. From 2000 to 2006, the global pool of savings rose from 36 to $70 trillion. Large companies in America are holding a lot more cash than the historical average. This last one's maybe the most important. The top 20% of Americans own the vast majority of the wealth in our country. And so there's evidence that we do have excess capital in the system, creating pressure for speculation. The second question, did the excess money in the system cause financial speculation and a market bubble? Well, we know what happened with the mortgage market, but this quote from a former Wall Street broker is interesting. It was unbelievable. We almost couldn't produce enough mortgage-backed securities to keep the appetite of the investors happy. More people wanted bonds than we could actually produce. That was our difficult task, was trying to produce enough. From our standpoint, it's like there's this guy out there with a lot of money. We got to find a way to fill his appetite, and his appetite's massive. This is the end of the 5 why questioning here, by the way. A lot of things happened to create the crash in real estate, but the ultimate root cause was this giant pile of money that was dumped onto the mortgage market. And it cried for release, and so the product was created. And as we know, a lot of that product was of very poor quality. But the thing that made it all possible was this giant pool of money. Is there evidence of a rise in income inequality? Well, there's quite a few statistics that support that, but I'd like to skip to a graph, because graphs are very easy to understand. This charts the share of the top 1% income share between 1913 and 2008. And you can see the peak around 1929 when the Great Recession hit. And during the Depression and World War II and during the decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that share went down tremendously, and America became a more equal society. Well, you'll notice that around 1980 that the trend starts upward again. And is that a coincidence? What happened? Well, it started upward when we implemented supply-side economics. Our country made a conscious decision to transfer more of the nation's wealth to the wealthy. And that's when that curve started up again. And if you compare the two peaks, when we reached the level that we had been at in 1929, lo and behold, we had another economic crisis. Us engineers call that correlation. Why did it take 30 years for supply-side economics to cause the Great Recession? Well, Robert Reich has talked a lot about this, and I'm quoting from him here, but the main point is that Americans are resilient. We delayed the inevitable crash through three coping mechanisms. First, we sent our mothers into the workforce in record numbers, starting in the late 1970s. Second, we worked more hours than we had before. And I think anyone can see that the combination of these two factors was very stressful to our families, and as a cause of a lot of the stress that our families have had the last few decades. And finally, as everyone knows, we drew down our savings and we borrowed more. We stopped saving, we drew down our savings, and we went into debt. And again, going back to the Mariner Eccles poker game, despite all these coping mechanisms, eventually all the chips belonged to just a few people at the table, and when that happened, the game stopped. Conclusion is the events leading up to the Great Recession mirror the conditions leading up to the Great Depression. Mariner Eccles could have predicted our Great Recession, and many of his modern disciples did predict it. And of course, let's not forget the human side. A couple of scientists, Wilkinson and Pickett, did a study where they created an index of the health of a society. And you can see on the left-hand side of the graph the different things that are included in that index, just measuring the well-being of a society. And they discovered that a score on this index did not correlate to absolute wealth in a society in the advanced Western democracies. What they did correlate to was the degree of income inequality. And unfortunately, you can see where the USA lies. We had the greatest income inequality, and we scored the worst on this index of health and social problems. And so there's a human cost to this also. Let's briefly examine the alternative economic model, supply-side economics. In 1980, government policy was changed to purposely redistribute more of the nation's wealth to the wealthiest. We were promised the benefits would trickle down. After 30 years, conservative leaders are still preaching the same gospel. Let's just give a little more money to the wealthy, and the economy will grow so much that everyone will benefit. I have to ask the question, does the data fit that model? We've looked at all the statistics. Is it working the way that we were promised in 1980? When do we finally say enough is enough? Your model doesn't work. A few final thoughts. Everyone wants the government to be as efficient as small as possible, but effective at performing its necessary functions. But I have to ask, what's the most important question? How big should the government be? That is absolutely a critical question, and one that's gotten a lot of discussion the last few years. But what about the second question? Who controls our government? A few final thoughts. The the final why, I believe, in language that Utahns understand. The root cause of the Great Recession was the worship of money. Government policy for 30 years has favored the rich. Because of our shared values, Utahns understand better than anyone what happens to riches when we worship them. They are taken from us. Americans need to follow the lead of the Occupy movement, and we need to take the control of our government back from the money worshippers. And that is the only way that the problems that led to the Great Recession will be solved. And I believe our Utah values can lead the way. Let me put up this quote from Brigham Young as I discuss it just briefly. Let's face it, Brigham Young was one of probably the greatest practical economists in the nation's history. He took 100,000 people into an arid desert and made it blossom as the rose. And let's be honest with ourselves, he didn't do that through an economic system of greed and pursuit of selfish interest. He did it through sacrifice, cooperation, and concern for the entire community, and not just for single individuals. I believe Brother Brigham would be very disappointed at the state of America today, where in large degree an American child opportunities in education and their future depend very much on the economic class that they come from. That's not what America is about, and I think that's not what the greatest generation fought and died for. And what we've been able to show through the Eccles model is not only is the current model unfair to our people, but it's actually destructive to the overall economy as a whole. I hope you'll join me in helping our fellow Utahns to return to their true values. I believe if we do, that we can lead the nation in making America work for all her citizens again. Thank you for your time.